British Columbia is world-renowned for its natural beauty, diverse communities, and thriving culture. It's also known for being in the grips of a housing affordability crisis decades in the making, which has been compounded by a poison drug crisis and by the COVID-19 pandemic. The province has an ambitious plan to address the crisis through the largest investment in housing affordability in BC's history. Tasked with building tens of thousands of homes in hundreds of communities is BC Housing, the province's agency responsible for developing, managing, and administering a wide range of subsidized housing and homelessness services across the province. BC Housing doesn't do this alone. To address the challenge, they're working with hundreds of partners. In this podcast, you'll get to hear from those delivering innovative and exciting affordable housing solutions. I'm Sara from BC Housing, and this is Let's Talk Housing. Welcome. In today's episode, we'll be talking about the systemic change required to address the root causes of homelessness. We'll be discussing long-standing barriers such as colonialism and discrimination that have harmed Indigenous, 2S LGBTQ+, disabled, and racialized people in British Columbia. We are fortunate today to be speaking with two experts who are dedicated to breaking down barriers to housing, ensuring it is affordable and appropriate for people who are working to make ends meet. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that we are recording this podcast on the ancestral homelands of hundreds of Indigenous peoples and nations across British Columbia, each with their own unique traditions and history. Today, we are located on the ancestral and unceded homelands of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations, who have been the caretakers of these lands for thousands of years. We offer respect to their peoples, past and present. Also, full transparency, this episode is being recorded in October 2021 and reflects the issues at that time. Today, we are joined by BC Housing's Vice President of Strategic Business Operations and Performance, S1E11, Allen, who is also a founding board member of the Hogan Alley Society and is an expert on the intersectionality between equity, housing, and activism. We also welcome community organizer Chrissy Brett, an Indigenous woman from Nuxalk First Nation and Namigans, a 60s scoop survivor and someone with an advanced analysis on homelessness based on her lived experience of living in and supporting 14 homeless encampments in BC. Her work has focused on ensuring those living outside have dignity and care, and on working for everyone to have a safe place indoors to live. S1E, I'm hoping we can start with you really just giving us some context for our conversation today. You work in a Crown agency, BC Housing, and then you have leadership roles in a number of community organizations, including, as I mentioned in the introduction, with Hogan Alley. So as someone who understands both of these worlds, how do you think that government and advocates can work together to address challenges in our communities?
Yeah, I think, coming into BC Housing has been a learning curve for me. But what has always been true long before I joined this work was that the answers and solutions to the problems facing communities really do rest with communities, particularly those communities that have been systemically discriminated against. When you're talking about Indigenous communities, when you're talking about racialized communities, people who are facing barriers to full participation in society, it's absolutely a matter of having the wisdom to listen and work with communities. And I think that's the challenge in front of public servants, in front of government, is are we taking the time to listen, to understand, and to reflect back that we've heard what communities are asking for when it comes to these long-standing issues of poverty, of housing insecurity, of communities that have been neglected and lacking the investments and resources that they need to thrive. So I think it's a very necessary relationship. I think it takes humility when we're in government roles or in leadership or institutional settings to put any kinds of notions that we have all the answers aside and to really, really listen, and then to show in our policies and our work that we have heard, and to make sure those voices are at the table leading the work themselves.
S1E, you've shared some really important perspectives there. So Chrissy, what I'd really like is to hear from your perspective, What do you think we can learn from how government has responded to encampments?
I think that people don't understand how necessary they are, and acknowledging the strengths within those communities that exist way before I get there or anyone in government gets there. And that people are coming from broken systems that have failed them from federal level to provincial level, that have caused them to become homeless. They're veterans that should not be homeless. Like, the country they fight for should be caring for them and ensuring that they're never at any one of those encampments. There are paramedics that have seen such trauma in their work that they've ended up self-medicating, and they find themselves without a mental health system that can support them through that trauma, and through self-medication find themselves in a place like a tent city. And I just find that we need to look at like a real human rights point of view of caring for people. And that's not something I see in a colonial state of Canada. You look at Indigenous people and families from many different like continents, and it's all based around family and taking care of each other and making sure that the most vulnerable within those communities are cared for. And you don't see that through Canada. And my work started off with Aboriginal child welfare, and I was really lucky to see integrated case management being brought in, and multidisciplinary teams that like cross different ministries, from justice to child welfare to education and employment, and even MCFD, and to see that work and that ability to bring things together, and cross those different ministry silos that are usually the breakdown that cause people to become homeless. It was homeless people that actually came and supported when my activism started around Aboriginal child welfare issues. And then I just saw how much of similarity and same issues that those people like had. And then we were able to work together to create things. And I never planned on working in the homeless, which is an industry. I mean, and people make money working for supporting homeless people, and yet they're not listening to them. So I think it's important to try and find a balance of what works and what doesn't. I think asking people, which is that wraparound integrated case management that I learned from British Columbia, building bridges, not barriers, is something that they did through Ministry for Children and Families in the 90s. And it was really breaking down those barriers and figuring out who best works with the person that you're talking about. And those are the things that you don't see in homelessness or through, I would almost say, anti-supports, NGOs that call themselves supportive housing, because I don't see hardly anything supportive. And I think it can't be housing first and then bring in supports. It needs to be bringing those supports into housing with the people, because
that's a good
that's
point.
what's not working.
The move, the transition. And where we always argue is that there's supports in the encampment, but there's also because of prohibition, there are predators. There are people that are facing violence. They're facing violence everywhere. They're facing violence in housing as well.
But because I jump between people in camp, they're not shot like Mike, who was shot 8 times. And not one of those news stories talked about him being in camp.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Like, how many people have died in housing since they left camp?
Well, there's a criminalization that occurs with encampments.
But if you don't bring in that community, then that criminalization just is the only existence.
Yeah.
And if there isn't an auntie that can yell at them go take care of your kids. Like, I can hear them yelling down there. Like, what is that banging? Like, am I going to go down there? And then people are like, no, because then you'll catch them doing bad, like things that come out of prohibition. I think for things to be successful, breaking down the silos and creating real inclusive kind of integrated case management takes a lot of hard work on everyone's plate. And if you look at the Federation of Youth and Care Networks, it's now an international program that is supported by Ministry for Children and Families here in BC, but across the world. And it's a really good and amazing mentorship peer program that allows people to create that autonomy of a community and supporting each other. But I think they've also have learned that exclusive communities are then excluding people, and that's where sometimes those breakdowns come from. So learning from them, from both sides, government and some of these like peer programs that need to be able to work more closely together, and realizing that reconciliation and working together isn't a Disney or Hallmark moment. What I've learned is it's more like Buckley's, like it tastes awful, but eventually it works if you allow it to. And that's what people, I think, aren't expecting when they go into looking at how can we work together.
I'd like to invite you, Stephanie, to build a little bit on what Chrissy's talking about and the importance of working together. Of course, one of the most recent examples, we touched on it at the top, was Strathcona Park Encampment. And for our listeners, BC Housing was tasked with bringing actually thousands of people indoors across multiple cities during the pandemic. And this was a really, really complex endeavor that included purchasing hotels and motels and then moving folks from outdoors into those hotels. Stephanie, can you tell us a little bit about how BC Housing approached that process and how you worked with community leaders like Chrissy?
Yeah, we were, the first time I met Chrissy was on an invitation to go to Oppenheimer Park. So it had just come off the moving effort that was made in 2019. And we had an invitation for people in senior roles to come and listen to how that process worked for them and to understand what their concerns were. And so we responded to that invitation. I attended that conversation. And at the time, Chrissy was righteously hot under the collar. And we appreciated, at least I did, the kinds of things that were really driving her concerns and her a justifiable anger about how things went. And so subsequently, we attended meetings every week that Chrissy would hold for campers to meet with members and leaders of the jurisdictional authorities. The City of Vancouver, the Parks Board, and BC Housing were all invited to those meetings. The reason I went was because I recognized what Chrissy was trying to convey to us was to help us make the process better. I think what we were hearing was not that there was a resistance to live in housing. I think we got to bust that myth right up front. People who are homeless want housing. They don't choose to be outside. What they're reflecting back to us is that the available options aren't working. And so it was that conversation that led us to recognize that there's a lot of ways that we needed to improve our process. And so it's full credit to Chrissy and to the outreach folks that have been on the ground working with people and understanding, and navigating and helping people navigate the system of moving indoors. So that when we moved folks indoors from Oppenheimer, and then subsequently a year later at Strathcona, it was very clear to us that we were evolving our own best practices, addressing concerns about hygiene, addressing concerns about supply, addressing the concerns that were coming up on the ground. And one of the primary concerns was to not use heavy-handed enforcement tactics to move people into housing. We're talking about people that were, the populations are hovering around 40% Indigenous, another 10 or 12% racialized, people who have bad experiences in the system already. And so we wanted to make sure that we were not re-traumatizing people in the effort to get them help. So we listened to that as well. We had a very strong communication process with the enforcement bodies. There's oftentimes different and conflicting priorities for us, but we tried our best to work through them with the sole purpose of moving people indoors safely. And full credit goes to the people on the ground, the people living in those tents, and the outreach workers who took that case management approach to moving people indoors safely and recognizing the barriers that have been existing for people to get inside.
But I think also recognizing that work and the allies, not just from BC Housing, but the fact that here it was only BC Housing and Parks that ever came to those meetings, and sometimes ambulance. But in Vic, it was Vic PD, it was the fire department, it was environmental health, it was MCFD, and everyone played a role in that multidisciplinary team. And we had good community cops that were housing outreach. And literally for our hardest to house woman, they actually were her housing outreach people until they retired, because no housing organization would take her on without somebody else doing the delivery of housing notices or anything. And there were 2 staff sergeants that were willing to do that. And until you start figuring out who are people going to listen to, sometimes it's me, but it's usually me figuring out who they'll listen to. And I mean, I never thought I'd say that a cop was my friend, but at the end of it, I had to admit it. And now 4 years later, I don't make a really bad face while admitting it, but that took a lot of time to realize that not all of them are evil. But I mean, leadership roles have changed, and they've gone back to more of that sort of corporal punishment type of community policing that's non-existent in Victoria. So you just have to build your allies when you can and accept that it's going to be hard work for everyone until everyone pulls together and starts building something from a real sort of multidisciplinary team.
We've really touched on some of the changes that have happened over the past few years, but I think we can all agree that there's still work to do. Chrissy, what do you think BC Housing and our partners need to do better going forward to really address the needs of communities and encampments?
I think breaking those ministry silos down, and the Ministry for Children and Families, I don't have a lot of great things to say about them, but they did bring in the Office of Domestic Violence that was trying to break down those ministry silos that sort of work against each other, and those policies and practice standards that go completely against each other, where the Attorney General says something that goes completely against people's needs for mental health and in dealing with trauma before they address some of those issues of domestic violence that come into play, and how you treat people who have had trauma in their life that have then found themselves violent within intimate relationships, and how that needs to change. And so they looked at that sort of full spectrum of talking to education, talking to health, talking to the Attorney General and the Ministry of Justice, and then the court system, and all of these things that sort of are supposed to work together, but they only work for that one ministry. And how do you make it work for the person that really needs the help? And that's what needs to be done in housing. When you look at how many people are living in housing that they don't have access to their kids, and that nobody over 19 can be in. This housing first model is not working for anyone, because I feel so government is saying we need to get people indoors and then bring in the wraparound support services. And people already have small wraparound community support services that they found work for them. And unless you're able to bring that indoors, people go in, they feel isolated. And here in Canada, while the Attorney General is facing a class action lawsuit around putting people in segregation for more than 15 days if you're in jail has been considered cruel and unusual punishment through this fentanyl crisis. Anyone living in an SRO, a shelter, or even a park has been sentenced to segregation indefinitely. And so how is it that homeless people have less rights than someone who's in jail? In jail, you get 3 meals a day and snacks and things that are considered to the Canada Food Guide. And in SROs, you might get 1 meal a day, which I wouldn't really even consider a meal. But it's called supportive. And then you're not allowed to have a kettle. You're not allowed to have a kitchen utensil. You're not allowed to have a toaster or a microwave. How do people survive without those most basic human rights? And the segregation thing, there's more people that have died from this fentanyl crisis that we're living in than they have of COVID. So, I mean, I do understand that we need to look at the COVID restrictions, but you aren't even given the same rights as people who are housed, and acknowledging a COVID bubble can exist for people who are homeless, and the strength that people have in supporting each other. If there were more microeconomy paid peer programs that people agree, like maybe taking an honorarium for things that we're doing for each other will make our lives easier during Prohibition, will allow people to maybe then stabilize, support each other, and maybe not be having to fall back on criminal sort of elements of the life of Prohibition. And those are the things that I see work really well in places like tent cities. People support each other to go to the hospital and take care of their medical needs. And if they don't, the community will force them to do it, whereas they go into housing, and without that community following indoors, then people are falling through the cracks. And I have friends that have died from like blood poisoning because they haven't taken care of infections, yet they're living in a building with doctors and nurses. And if we paid peers to like force their friends to go and take care of themselves, those people might still be alive today. And so unless you find out who can work with that person and who that person will listen to, and asking, what do you need? How can we help you? Then it's always going to be about the government and not about the person that we should be helping. And we really do need to live by listening to people from that place of, how can I help you? And sometimes it's really simple, and other times it's really complex. And what we saw at Strathcona was 200 volunteers that I've never had before that came and supported that community, from laundry to culture to programs that they created themselves to health, and all of these things that should be in supportive housing that's not. And if you can't afford it, then maybe hire some volunteer coordinators and allow the community to really step forward and support community members in the way that we had at the encampment. And sometimes it doesn't have to cost money. There's people within a community that are willing to step forward and offer free life skills or free counseling. And those are the things that I don't see in housing.
What a complex challenge. Thank you for that, Chrissy. And as you mentioned, it really does take an entire community. Steph, I'd like you to help us wrap things up here by speaking to how we can use housing and really set up housing so that it works for all people.
Yeah, very, very complex question. And I think we really need to have, members of the communities that aren't working directly in housing come to terms with understanding the vital importance of it. We all love living somewhere where we love to live. That's true for every single human being. It's just some of us have the privilege to make that choice and others don't. So it is everybody's business to see and to support the types of housing solutions that communities need. We should work together, all of us, until no one in our community is homeless. When you think of what Chrissy has said, reflecting on Indigenous worldviews, I come from people who themselves were descendant of enslaved people and on these lands, and recognizing the way that I walk and interplay on these lands because of the significance of what it means to recognize and work in solidarity with Indigenous peoples. I myself live on and work on the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh lands. And so it's the reflection of this longstanding history, how we got to live in a society where some people have way more home than they may need, and some don't. And it really is everyone's obligation not to turn a blind eye, not to use pejoratives or discriminatory language, but to recognize that we have some gaps in our system that existed long before any of us got on the scene, but that it is our responsibility collectively to address those gaps, to close them forever, so that no one's kids, no one's family members, no one's, school chum are finding themselves without the care, support, healthcare, and opportunities that every life deserves. So I think that's our challenge. And BC Housing's just one entity in the solution. But I think it's about how we rally, how we inspire, how each of us in our various roles and responsibilities can call others in to share. Because I think if we don't have an approach like that, and if we continue to see polarizing language around homeless people, around people who are unsheltered, or people who are struggling with, substance use, we're not going to get the society that we long for, which is safe and secure. And I think everybody shares that desire to live relatively peacefully, securely, and free from harm. And I think it's incumbent on those of us who have those privileges to work until this is no longer, the harm is no longer facing anyone in our community. So that's kind of what I think drives me in the work. And I know it drives people like you and my colleagues in BC Housing and our partners in the housing sector. We've got work to do. We've got lessons to continue to learn. And we're just grateful that people like Chrissy take her time to help us understand that work and how we can do better.
Well, what a thought-provoking conversation. Thank you, Stephanie, and thank you, Chrissy, for joining us here today. Let's talk again soon. To learn how to apply for subsidized housing in British Columbia, visit our website, bchousing.org. You can also call us at 1-800-257-7756. That's 1-800-257-7756.